Hey guys, welcome back for another week. Sorry, I'm not in the greatest filming location. I'm in my dad's kind of messy office. This week I actually, well, like I said, I'm in my dad's office, which means that I'm back in the US. I'm not in Italy right now anymore. So I'm not probably going to be making a whole lot of surviving Italy videos. But I wanted to make one last video for the moment about what my final experience was like dealing with a lot of the travel restrictions and kind of, well, just dealing with living in Italy towards the end of my time there when all of the quarantine was really ramping up. And then finally my experience getting home, because it was not easy, let me tell you. So I'll start with kind of explaining what my time was like there as soon as all of the quarantine stuff began. Not even just the quarantine, but as soon as all of the, I don't know, just weird restrictions and changes started happening because of COVID-19.
Ma perché ci sono gli scaffali della pasta vuoti? Ma che cosa sta succedendo? Manco quando è scoppiata la seconda guerra mondiale c'era stato un panico così.
So it started one week when I was changing host families. I stayed with two different host families during my time in Italy, and the weekend that I was changing host families, they told me, hey, the school has been canceled this week because of some of the health concerns regarding this coronavirus, or coronavirus, as they said, which I really hadn't heard too much about at this point. So I was like, oh, okay. And I didn't go to work at the school that week, which is fine. I teach some online, and I just kind of spent that week getting to know my new host family and teaching. But after that, when I kind of started to realize that maybe we would not be going back to school ever, that got a little crazy. And it started to ramp up when my flight home got canceled. I had a flight through Turkish Airlines, and it had a layover that was supposed to stop in Turkey. And pretty early on, the Turkish government stopped allowing anyone who had been in Italy recently to come into their country. So I had to cancel, well, they canceled that flight, and I had to find a new flight as quickly as I could, because since my program was just about 3 months, or it was supposed to be, it worked out really well with just having a tourist visa. It wasn't a work program exactly, and so I didn't have a work visa to be there, so I really could only be in the country for 90 days. So I had to find another flight, which thankfully I found a really good flight through United that was supposed to leave March 29th, I think. I booked that flight. Well, that was the Sunday night in which later that night, Giuseppe Conte, the Prime Minister of Italy, announced that they were turning all of Lombardia and I think Veneto too at that point into a red zone, and they were restricting travel, and they were pretty much going into a pretty deep quarantine here. And so at that point, I actually was not with my host family. I was staying at my boyfriend's family's house, which is in Lombardia. We had to go back to where he works the next day, and instead of me going back to my host family and him going to work, I just decided to go to his apartment, which is not in Lombardia, and stay there, because I was just worried that if I went back to the host family, I would not be able to come back to visit him. I would not be able to travel to get to my flight. Another thing is that I did not book a flight out of Italy. Out of fear that it would get canceled or I would not be allowed to fly out of Italy, I booked a flight leaving from Munich, Germany. And my plan had always been that I would take a train from my boyfriend's apartment the day that I needed to fly, take a train to Munich, and that's how I would get to the airport. And worst case scenario, he could drive me there. Well, basically 2 days after they announced that Lombardia and Veneto would be red zones, they announced that the entire country was just going to be a red zone and that travel was severely restricted, and you just really aren't supposed to travel unless it was for emergency reasons, like, or just like if you have to go to work. Obviously you can travel to go to work, to go home, or for emergency reasons, or to go to the grocery store, but you weren't just supposed to travel for travel's sake. Basically, all of this is a little jumbled, but things were just happening in a very short span of time. They started closing down stores that were non-essential, but restaurants were open for a little bit, but they had restrictions like they could only be open from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. and you could only be served if you had a table. Bars couldn't serve people who were just standing around anymore. Everyone had to have a table and you had to remain 1 meter apart from each other, but pretty quickly that just changed to all bars, all restaurants closing, and basically just keeping open the essential services like pharmacies and grocery stores, and then hospitals, I would assume. And then workplaces, public meeting spaces like restaurants and things like that were closed, but you could, if you work at a company and the company hadn't closed, then I think you were still expected to go to work. But similarly to the US, a lot of places and companies, from what I hear, were trying to find ways to help their employees work from home. So anyways, all of this is happening, all of, weddings and funerals and concerts and everything's being canceled. And I'm starting to get extremely worried that my flight will be canceled. And then I started to have another concern, which is that Austria, which is in between Italy and Germany, closes their borders. And they stop all train services through their country, which means that I can't take a train there, and it's very unlikely that we would be able to drive to the border and they would let us through on my way to Germany. And not to mention that, but if my boyfriend was going to drive me there, he would have to drive back, and it was concerned that the police might stop him and not be convinced that he did have a necessary reason for traveling, and it just became very complicated very quickly, and I was worried that I would not be able to get to my flight. I forgot to mention, at some point I did call United and I switched my flight to about a week earlier, to March 21st instead of March 29th. But the kind of final straw here that really broke the camel's back was about a week and a half before that, I guess maybe it would have been 2 weeks. I don't know. Okay, I can't do the math in my head that quick. But basically it was this travel ban on European citizens or foreigners who have been in Europe coming to the US. Our president announced that they're not allowed to come anymore. And that kind of induced this widespread panic from anyone in Europe that felt they needed to get to the US, both in European citizens but also in American citizens, because even though you think, oh, this doesn't affect you, you're an American citizen, you're still allowed in, but the fact of the matter is, if so many people are canceling their flights because they're not allowed into the US anymore, then airlines realistically probably will have to cancel certain flights if they don't have enough passengers. And so I began to get extremely worried that my flight would get canceled, let alone I also just didn't have a way to get there. So I was calling, I was making many calls. I called the US Embassy, who basically told me nothing helpful. They were like, we can't help you because
you're a US citizen, so you should be able to get home.
And I was like, no, I'm saying that this has made it very difficult for me to get home. Can you help me find a way to get home? And they basically said, no, sorry, we can't help you. Yeah, that was great. But then I called United a bunch of times, and I was on the phone with United for a while, and they very graciously found me a connecting flight. I think, from what I understand now, it was one of the last flights that United was even flying within Europe. It was a flight from Milan to Munich. So I now had a connecting flight that I could get to Milan, because that's still in Italy, so I can travel to Milan. I don't have to cross any country borders, but then take that flight to Munich, and then the flight from Munich to Chicago, which I'm not from Chicago, but that is, that's where my flight was. And I'm close enough to Chicago that I can find someone to pick me up, so. Anyways, So they graciously found me a flight. They did not charge me extra, even though they added basically an entire leg to my trip. That was super nice. And they basically told me, we just want you to get home, and I really, really appreciated that. This kind of leads into the time period that I'm leaving. Now, by the time that I am getting close to my flight, Italy is really on lockdown. My experience going to the grocery store was so strange. When I would go with my boyfriend to the grocery store, there would be a man at the door who is basically manning the queue because there's just a line of people that they won't let you in at the same time. It's like one at a time. Even if you came together, like we had to remain separate. You had to stay a meter apart anywhere in public, and they really enforced it at the grocery store. We got yelled at by like a deli worker when me and my boyfriend got within like a couple of feet of each other because we were looking at cheese or something, and they really like laid into us. And I think it's because they can get in trouble with the law if like a police officer were to come in and see that they are allowing anyone to get within a meter of each other. All of the employees had the face masks on, and it was just a very bizarre energy, you know, really subdued. And they did have, I mean, they were kind of out of fruits and vegetables when we were there. I'm not really sure what was up with that, but they didn't seem to have, at least at this point, towards the end of my time there, they kind of passed the panic of like buying up toilet paper and weird stuff that we're now having in the US. And then they would have like police cars and firemen and things roaming the streets sometimes during the day with like a megaphone or something, calling out to everyone to not leave their homes.
Attention please. For safety and health reasons, you are required to stay at home in compliance with the coronavirus instructions provided by the authorities. Exit is allowed.
It was very apocalyptic, and like when we walked around it, like to go to the grocery store and things like that, it was just so empty. It was such a sight to see. Like that, I will never have that experience again, is to see some of these cities, well, not some of the cities, the city that I was in, completely empty in the middle of a beautiful Sunday afternoon. So it was really strange. Now I'll get into my actual journey on my way home, because it was quite interesting and eventful.